Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. The project I'm going to talk about today is co-authored work with colleagues from Italy. That's Jacopo from the US, that's Gordon Dahl, and Malte Sandner, who is in Nuremberg. And let me try to motivate this study. So one of the defining characteristics of our societies today is population aging. And population aging has many consequences, many implications in our societies. I'm an economist, so for labor markets, of course, it means that with population aging, we see a reduction in the share of working age individuals. And that poses many challenges to our economies. Shortage of skilled labor is just one example. So in the face of population aging, so if we want to sustain economic growth, productivity, innovation, also fiscal balance, it really requires us to think about how we can mobilize underutilized labor resources. And there's not so many policy levers that we have in this regard. So we can think about extending the working lives of older workers. That's certainly one important area. We can think about women who, despite the human capital that they bring with them, are still, have a much lower participation in the labor market than men. But then also, and that's where our study is coming in, a very important part of this untapped labor market potential in our society lies with immigrants. And in particular with their second-generation children who are born in the host country. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a few facts. So this talk will be about the second-generation immigrants. So these are children of immigrants who are born in their host country, but have parents who are foreign-born. Okay, so that will be the group that I will be talking about today. And I'm going to show you a number of facts about second-generation immigrants now. One fact will be that they are demographically a super important group. But then the other facts will be that they are really far from realizing their full potential in our societies in Europe. Okay? So let's jump into this. Fact number one, second-generation immigrants are a demographically very important group. So you have a map of Europe here. We have countries shaded in yellow to red, and the darker the color, the larger or the more important or the larger is the share of second-generation immigrants in the total population. So if you pick out two of the largest economies, countries in Europe, Germany and France, you can see here that amongst individuals aged 15 to 24, almost 1 in 5 individuals will have a migration background, will be a second-generation immigrant. Some countries, such as Switzerland or Luxembourg, this share is much higher. So demographically, this is already a very important group. These shares will increase mechanically over time. Second fact is that in Europe, the second generation grows up with severe childhood disadvantages. This is just one descriptive statistic here. So what this map is showing is just relative childhood poverty risks. So relative risk is always the risk second-generation immigrants grew up in poverty relative to children of native-born parents. I call them natives here in this talk. And so for Germany, you will see a number that's 1.5. And what this is saying is simply that natives in Germany will have a childhood poverty risk of roughly 15%. For second-generation immigrants, this is 50% higher. So the relative risk is 1.5. In France, as a second example, childhood poverty risks for second-generation immigrants are almost 3 times as high as for natives. Next fact, these childhood disadvantages are carried forward into education and also into the labor market. So here in this map, I'm showing against the relative risks, in this case for lacking basic reading skills at age 15. And this is data taken from the PISA studies. And if you want to kind of focus again on Germany and on, say, France, you can see that this risk of lacking basic reading skills is twice as high for the second generation than it is for natives. Okay, so in Germany, maybe 10% of children with native-born parents will lack basic reading skills at age 15. For second-generation immigrants, that number is twice as high. Okay. What about the labor market? So here in this map, we see the risk of unemployment for 15 to 24-year-olds. And you see the same picture, basically. For the second generation in Germany, the risk of being unemployed is twice as high as for natives. Okay. And I could go on showing you other kind of descriptive statistics, the probability of neither being in employment, education, or training. You would always get the same kind of picture. Okay. Now, I call this fact 4, but it's more like an observation. And that is, well, the second generation is largely overlooked by policy. It's also understudied in research. So what do I mean by that? So historically, many of our societies in Europe are migration societies, and there have been integration efforts to integrate immigrants into our economies and societies. But those efforts have largely been directed at the first generation. And it has been done through language programs, vocational programs, the combination of the two, pathways to legal status, pathways to citizenship. But all largely focused on the first generation. Very different for the second generation. They are assumed, or they are often assumed to integrate naturally. Why? Well, because they have grown up in the host country. And so the consequence of this is that interventions that are directed at them are very uncommon. Again, the reason is that they are presumed to already benefit from the host country schooling system and all the other universal programs, policies that are in place. But then when you look at some of these universal programs that could really matter for the second generation in particular, such as public childcare, you will find that uptake amongst immigrant families is also very low. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say that the second generation plays a rather peripheral role in policy. Now that peripheral role in policy is also limited, is also reflected in kind of limited evidence that we have on which interventions could foster the long-term integration of second-generation immigrants. And that's where our study will come in. Okay? So in this paper, I'm going to exploit a fairly unique setting. And the setting is Germany in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And for children born to immigrants in Germany at around that time, their early childhood conditions changed quite markedly due to two major developments. So on the one hand, starting in the mid-1990s, Germany started to expand early childcare. So that's childcare for 3 to 6-year-olds. Just as an example, a legal entitlement to a childcare slot in kindergarten was implemented in the late 1990s. Okay, and I'm not going to actually leverage this expansion, but I'm going to exploit a unique feature, institutional feature, and just bear with me, I'll be more specific about this, that allows me to study what's the effect of giving children around half a year of extra early childcare. All of that at the age of 3, okay? So that's one major change that took place in the late 1990s. The other one And that's one of the few policies that's actually was targeted at second-generation immigrants. That was the introduction of birthright citizenship. So literally endowing children with a passport at birth. Okay? And what we are doing in this paper is we study the long-term effects of these two changes. So one is a kind of a universal change that affected all children in our society. The other one was targeted at second-generation immigrants within the same setting and using the same data. Okay. And this is maybe what we like to do as economists. It's just a preview of our findings. So what are our main findings? What we show is that giving or having extra early childcare, again, this is around 5 months of extra early childcare. This has fairly limited effects for natives, but it has sizable effects on second-generation immigrants. Once they enter early adulthood at the age around 20, 22, amongst them, it causes higher college attendance rates and lower welfare dependency. Birthright citizenship, that's the second policy, also shifts trajectories of the second generation towards college rather than vocational training or early labor market entry. Then, in terms of the mechanisms behind this, we also show that these two policies boost academic outcomes at earlier stages, so before they enter the labor market, before the school-to-work transition, but they do have divergent effects on high school dropout risk. Now, I think these findings are kind of interesting in themselves. I think they also have some broader implications here. So, I mean, my observation is that we are currently, when it comes to policies supporting immigrants, we are currently moving away from a world where we have tried to be very inclusive, making efforts to integrate immigrants to more exclusive frameworks, withdrawing support for immigrant population. And so our findings for birthright citizenship show that, if we curtailing these targeted efforts to integrate immigrants, this can have really substantial long-term economic costs. The findings, however, also show that, that broad-based early human capital policies, such as childcare, can act as a partial substitute in this kind of changing policy environment. Okay. I mean, contributions to the literature, let me be brief. I mean, we are contributing to the literature that has looked at the long-term effects of universal childcare. The evidence so far is very scarce, and there's a reason for that, because many advanced economies have introduced universal childcare only over the recent decades, and it always takes 10 or 20 years to really look at long-term outcomes. There is, however, a very insightful literature that studies the more short-term outcomes. Okay, so that's where our study is contributing. The second contribution lies in the area of citizenship. So we do have quite extensive work on naturalization for adults. What's the impact, of avoiding citizenship to adults? But we have still relatively little causal evidence on birthright citizenship, and that's despite its central role worldwide, right? So this is one of the major avenues of acquiring citizenship worldwide. Now, Germany is very interesting in this respect because it's the only major immigration country who has introduced birthright citizenship in recent decades. And Regina and I have done several studies that have looked at this policy and its impacts in the short run, in the shorter run, during childhood, during adolescence. Okay. And of course, this study comes in and really thinks about whether these early gains that we, by the way, have identified in our research, whether they dissipate over time or whether they persist into adulthood. Okay. So let me tell you now about the setting. There's two policies. The first one I've already mentioned. There was a large expansion of public childcare in the late 1990s in Germany. That's not what I'm going to exploit. What I'm going to exploit is that there were with the expansion, policymakers also had to think about how to kind of manage the whole kind of expansion. And so the expansion came with age-based enrollment rules, okay, which meant that, and I'll be more specific about this, that because of these enrollment rules, some children could be admitted to early childcare at the age of 3, others had to wait. Okay, and I'll come back to this. But what I'm really exploiting here is not the expansion as such, but I will be kind of exploiting age-based enrollment rules into childcare. Now, why do we think that this kind of policy variation that I'm going to exploit could matter in the long run? Well, the variation is really at a very critical age for children. It's at the age of 3. That's a critical period for language skills. And if you think about second-generation immigrants in Germany, they very often grow up in homes where, say, German is not being used as the main language. So if you enter childcare early at exactly that age, you will have interaction with natives. That can be a foundation for your cognitive development, also for non-cognitive development, by the way. And so the question will be, is that the case? And if so, will we observe kind of persistent effects of this? So there's only one other paper who has leveraged exactly these age-based enrollment rules, and this paper has found no short-run effects on natives, so no effects on natives during childhood. The second policy is the introduction of birthright citizenship. So that was a shift from jus sanguinis to jus soli, and that shift really literally took place on January 1st, 2000. So rather than only becoming a German citizen at birth when one of your parents already was a German citizenship, under certain conditions you would automatically become, with January 1st, German citizens if you were born in Germany. Okay, and I'll show you exactly how immigrant children were kind of, how many. I'll give you an estimate for the first stage. In the first stage, we simply mean, how many children actually benefited from that reform in terms of, having a passport from birth onwards. Now that policy very likely, the reason why that policy could matter in the long run differs from early childcare, right? So early childcare is more, you are kind of exposed to the kindergartens, you're exposed to other natives, you are maybe exposed to German language on a regular basis. If that policy, if citizenship, birthright citizenship is to work, something else must be happening, right? So as economists, the argument is, of course, with having a passport from birth onward gives you the same legal rights, opportunities as natives, access to the same jobs, civil servant jobs, and so on and so forth. So this means that there are higher returns to education. And during childhood, the idea is that parents respond to that by investing more into their children's human capital. Later on in adulthood, when the children who've been benefiting from this reform realize also that they have the same opportunities as their native counterparts, it could be that their aspirations increase. Okay, so while we do believe that both policies could have long-term effects, the pathways are very likely different. Okay, and the evidence to date on that policy is that the introduction of birthright citizenship in Germany has indeed led to much better outcomes for second-generation immigrants in childhood. Okay, the setting in Germany is fairly unique. What I will show you now is that we can actually examine the long-term effects of these two early childhood interventions in the same econometric setting, empirical setting, and using the very same data. And the reason for that is that so both policies rest on birth date eligibility cutoffs. In fact, they rest on the same birth date eligibility cutoff. So the childcare reform means that, and I will show you evidence on this, is that children born just before versus after January 1st of a given year in the late 1990s would have 5 extra months of early childcare. Okay. The citizenship reform, well, for that, citizenship at birth jumps by 52 percentage points for second-generation immigrants born just before and after January 1st, 2000. So what does this mean? This January 1st cutoff underlies both reforms. It has the key advantage that it lies in between school entry thresholds as well in Germany. The school entry thresholds in Germany are always at some point in the summer. So the school year runs from either June, July, or August until the next year. That January 1st cutoff lies right in the middle of a school year, okay? So, and then in this diagram here, you see how we can leverage this in our empirical design. So I will focus on just 3 cohorts of children, and I call them school cohorts. So school cohort 1 is born between July 1997 and June 1998. And the kids in the first half of the cohort benefited from extra childcare. The same is true for the second cohort, which I call school cohort 2. They are born from July 98 to June 99. And again, the first half of the cohort has extra early childcare. The third cohort, so these are kids born from July 1999 and June 2000, well, they're differentially exposed. So kids in these cohorts are differentially exposed to the 2 kind of, let's call it policies. The first half of the cohort benefited from more childcare. The second half of the cohort benefited from birthright citizenship. So what all of this means is that in our empirical design, I can use a simple regression discontinuity design to evaluate the effects of extra early childcare by just using individuals from cohort 1 and or cohort 2. And then I can implement a difference in discontinuity design to back out the effects of the long-term effects of birthright citizenship. So by that I mean I can implement or I can estimate an RD estimate for cohort 3, and I can subtract from that the RD estimate for the other 2 cohorts. Okay, so that's what we are doing empirically. Now the data. We are going to use social security data, which covers the universe of all individuals who have ever been employed on welfare or on an active labor market policy. The outcomes, the key long-term outcomes that I'm interested in and which we measure at age 22 are whether these kids attend college, whether they're in vocational training, they are already in employment, or whether they are on welfare. And to kind of understand mechanisms, we will also look at some pre-college educational milestones. So whether individuals have completed the academic track of high school, which is a precondition to enroll in college, whether they have completed the non-academic track of high school, or whether they have dropped out of high school with no degree. Okay? There are some challenges though. So this is of course excellent data. It's the universe of all ever employed individuals. But there are challenges. So the first challenge is that migration background is unobserved. All we observe in the data is nationality, but that's of course endogenous to one of the policies that we are studying. So we cannot use that as a proxy. How do we overcome that challenge? Well, we infer migration background from names using onomastic procedures. The good news is we've also fielded a survey through the Institute for Employment Research, and we can actually double check using the survey data that we've collected ourselves whether we do a good job in predicting migration background based on these procedures. Okay? The second challenge is that one of the outcomes that we really care about, which is college attendance, is also unobserved. This is only recorded upon completion of education, but these kids are now, or the data that we have, the kids are at most 22 years old. So they have not necessarily completed education yet. So our solution to that challenge is that we proxy college enrollment from the actual employment profiles of these individuals. And we do that manually, but just combining together different criteria that university students fulfill. But we also do this based on machine learning assisted predictions. Okay? And again, we can validate our proxy for college attendance using our self-collected data. We can also validate it externally using linked sub and university data. Okay? So remember, we only look at 3 cohorts, but even for these 3 cohorts, our sample size is quite substantial. So we have roughly 2.7 million observations. Of 750,000 of them are immigrants, and 150,000 of them have a Turkish background. Okay, so that's the sample that we are going to work with. Okay, empirical approach. I'll be quick on this. So how do we identify the effect of extended early childcare? Well, through a simple regression discontinuity design. So this is our estimation model. There's just 2 things that matter here. So we have a running variable, which is an individual's birth date relative to January 1st. And then we have another dummy that's indicating, it's just a dummy for whether you are born before or after January 1st. And in our baseline model, the f function is a simple linear function. Okay. Now in this model, the key estimate is really alpha 1 multiplied by -1. And that estimate captures the effect of 5 months of extra early childcare. And the reason is since those born after the cutoff are actually the ones receiving less early childcare. So this is why you need to pre-multiply by -1. And then to identify the effect of birthright citizenship, well, we just have to add the 3rd cohort. The 3rd cohort, the 3rd school cohort, who were differentially exposed to either early childcare and birthright citizenship. And all of this is just done by adding a dummy for individuals from the birthright citizenship cohort. So that's school cohort 3. And then just have appropriate interactions with the running variable, which is birth date, and the indicator for whether you are born before or after January 1st. Okay, so in this model, minus alpha 1 still captures the effect of extra early childcare, and beta 1 captures the effect of birthright citizenship. And this is what I meant by saying we can actually evaluate the effects of these 2 policies really in one go, using one empirical design, exactly the same data. Okay? But of course, I actually need to look at both policies, right? So I actually need to have them in the same setting, right? Yeah. So I don't need to speak about this diagram a lot here, because this is exactly the idea, testing for kind of bunching around the cutoff, and that's clearly not the case. So you see here the density of observations around the January 1st cutoff, and there are no bunches here around January 1st. So let me now turn to the results. So early childcare. So let me now tell you in detail what's been going on. So there has been a large expansion of public childcare for 3 to 6-year-old children in Germany in the late 1990s. Importantly, the expansion came with enrollment rules based on date of birth. So when is the standard intake into kindergarten? Well, that's when, of course, one cohort of kindergarten kids move on to school, and that's typically in the summer, say in August. So that's when standard intake into kindergarten takes place. Okay, that's when kids move to 1st grade in primary school. Now, the important thing about these enrollment rules is that children born between September and December of a given year, they were eligible to start in August before turning 3. Whereas children born in January, August, they must wait until they turn 3. Now, because of this intake, which usually takes place in the summer, this in practice means that most kids who are born between January and August must wait until the next August intake. And the consequence of this is that we have a discontinuity of roughly 5 months in childcare duration at the January 1st cutoff. Here's a picture that shows this. Pink bars are simply showing kind of densities for when children born between July and December of a given year enroll. And you can see that a large share of them will enroll in the summer months. The blue bars are for the kids, are the enrollment months for kids who are born between January and June. And you can see that most of them, they have to wait until the summer of the next year. Okay? And as a consequence of that, and that is our first stage, there is this roughly 5-month discontinuity in the duration of early childcare right at January 1st. Okay, and we've estimated this from NAPS data, basically, not from our labor market data. Okay, so that's our first stage. So these are our results for the full sample of second-generation immigrants. And the headline finding here is that these 5 extra months of early childcare at the age of 22 increases your probability of being in college by 2 percentage points. Okay, which is substantial given that second-generation immigrants' mean attendance rate at college is just 16%. Okay. We also see in this diagram that these 5 extra months of early childcare reduces welfare dependency at age 22 by 1.2 percentage points, which is again a substantial effect given the mean of 8%. And we don't see any kind of effects on being in vocational training or being in early employment. And just to convince you that these are real effects, and maybe you just want to focus on the graph in panel A. I mean, these are our RD. This is actually our model that we are estimating, our RD model. And you can already see it is almost the ideal RD design for the simple reason that we have dozens of observations for immigrant children per birthday. So we can identify these effects at the cutoff with a lot of precision at the end of the day. Okay, so that's just the RD plots that underlie the estimates that I've just shown. Then maybe understanding the mechanisms. So we move back a step, and so let's look at pre-college educational milestones. So the outcomes that we look at here are: have you completed the academic track of high school, the vocational track of high school, or no diploma means de facto you have dropped out of high school. And you can see that this extra 5 months of early childcare increases the probability of completing the academic track of high school by almost 3 percentage points, which is roughly a 10% increase. It also reduces the probability of dropping out of high school by 1.3 percentage points, which again, given the mean of 6%, is a sizable effect. Okay. So then let's think about heterogeneity by migration background. So here we split the sample. For the immigrants, the split that we are doing is distinguishing immigrants who have a Turkish background, because this is by far the largest immigrant group in Germany, and all the other immigrants. But then we also have estimates for natives. And what you can see here, that in terms of these extra childcare months, increasing college enrollment, we have large effects for both immigrants with a Turkish origin, an increase in the probability of going to college by 3 percentage points at a mean of 20%. A similar sized effect for the other immigrants. A still significant effect for natives, but really small quantitatively. Okay. And then in the panel B, and I'm not going to comment on that, is just looking at academic track completion, which is the prerequisite for going to college. Again, large and sizable effects for immigrants with a Turkish background and the other immigrants, and a null effect for natives. Okay. So then the second policy, birthright citizenship. So the context is the reform of German citizenship law in the late 1990s. The key change that we're exploiting here, which took effect on January 1st, 2000, is the introduction of birthright citizenship. So before the year 2000, kids at birth would only acquire citizenship by descent, so that's jus sanguinis. From 2000 onwards, there was automatic citizenship at birth if at least one parent had 8 or more years of legal residence in Germany. So that's jus soli. Okay. Now, the important thing about this reform is there was no opt-out for parents. Okay, so if parents satisfied the residency criterion, citizenship was automatically recorded in your birth certificate. The reform, and that's very important, had a particularly strong impact on children of Turkish origin. So the first stage is very strong. The reform had very strong bite because of the residency criterion for kids with a Turkish background, not on other immigrant groups, much less so for other immigrant subgroups in Germany, which of course means then the heterogeneity analysis will be particularly important for this policy. Okay, that's the first stage, and that's the first stage for children with a Turkish background. And that's just showing what's your probability of being a German citizenship at birth if you're born before the cutoff, versus what's your probability of having a passport at birth if you're born after the cutoff. And for second-generation immigrants with a Turkish background, that probability increases by 52 percentage points. Okay. And in terms of longer-term effects, there's still a discontinuity in citizenship at around the age of 20, of roughly 20 percentage points if I do compare these kids born before and after the cutoff. The first stage is much smaller for non-Turkish immigrants. So that same jump here that we see for those born before versus after in having a passport at birth would only be 24 percentage points for immigrants who don't have a Turkish background. And again, the reason really lies with the residency criterion. The parents had to be in Germany already for 8 years. And only if that condition was satisfied, the reform actually had bite, or, we were eligible for birthright citizenship. So here are the results for post-secondary outcomes for all immigrants. But remember, for all immigrants, we have a bit of a mushy first stage. There are some who've been very strongly affected by or strongly benefited from the reform, other immigrant groups who didn't strongly benefit from the reform. But that's the overall effect here. So we still see that the probability to attend college at age 22 increases by roughly 1 percentage points for those second-generation immigrants who benefited from the reform. And at the mean of 16%, that's still not a negligible kind of effect. What we also see is that the probability of being in vocational training drops by roughly the same amount. Okay. In terms of pre-college educational milestones, so did you complete the academic track, the vocational track of high school, or did you drop out of high school? We again find that those second-generation immigrants who benefited from birthright citizenship have a 1 percentage point higher probability of completing the academic track of high school. A 2 percentage point lower probability and a 2 percentage points lower probability of completing the vocational track of high school. Okay. Now here comes the really important estimate for birthright citizenship. So here we're looking at heterogeneity by migration background, which is important because it was the second-generation immigrants of Turkish origin who really strongly benefited from the reform. And for this group, we really estimate a very large and positive effect. So in column 1, you can see that the probability that immigrants with a Turkish origin are enrolled at college at age 22 increases by 5 percentage points. And that's compared to the mean, that's a 25% increase. We also see similarly pronounced effects for immigrants with a Turkish background on completing the academic track of high school. That probability goes up by 3.5 percentage points. And again, that's a sizable effect. We don't see any effects for other immigrants. And I don't know whether I have a slide on this. I mean, that's more like a sanity check. If you do the same estimate for natives, you also see 0 effects, but that should be the case because natives didn't benefit from that reform. Okay. Maybe just to zoom in, again, on the underlying RD estimate. So this is the first 2 panels are the important ones here, right? Because the estimates that I've just shown are combining together the 2 RD estimates that we see in panel A and B. So in panel A, we have the effect of early childcare, because that's only looking at school cohorts 1 and 2. In panel B, we look at school cohort 3, where the ones born before the cutoff benefit from extra childcare. The ones that benefit from citizenship are born after the cutoff. So the RDD estimate is just basically adding the negative discontinuity in panel A on top of the positive discontinuity in panel B. And that's the RD estimate. So birthright citizenship completely undoes, or more than undoes, the disadvantage of not having this extra 5 months of early childcare. That's what these RD plots are showing. Okay. So if you're born, panel A shows that if you're born from January to June, or not even June, it's just April. These are, by the way, just 4 months around the cutoff. You're disadvantaged in terms of your college enrollment. But for the third cohort, right, they are also disadvantaged in that respect, but they have birthright citizenship, and birthright citizenship completely undoes the disadvantage from not having this extra 5 months of early childcare. That's what I'm trying to say here. Okay. I don't need to go into this. These are just more RD plots. I've mentioned this. We can also, for birthright citizenship, we can use natives as a placebo test. Natives shouldn't be affected by birthright citizenship, and the table shows that this is not the case. Okay, so let's now think about these results a little bit. So what's going on here? So let's start with early childcare. So we find strong effects on college going at age 22 if you have 5 extra months of early childcare. And when we step back, we also find effects on high school outcomes, so completing the academic track of high school. Now, how can we rationalize all of this? Well, we can do that by looking at other studies who have looked at more the short-run effects of childcare during childhood. Christina has some work on this. And she has shown that, you know, if you do attend early childcare, it's not exactly the same policy variation. There are positive effects on language skills for immigrant children at school entry. And there are other papers who've highlighted similar effects. So what we believe is going on here is, so you have extra childcare at age 3. This means you have more interaction with natives. You spend less time in disadvantaged homes also where German is often not the language that's being spoken. Of course, other studies have shown that early language and cognitive development benefits from that. What our study shows is that these very small changes in early life conditions, it's just 5 extra months of childcare, they compound over time to really produce meaningful long-term effects. Okay. Then you could ask, are these effects kind of unreasonably high? And the answer is probably not, because I mean, there is also studies for the US that, you know, like kind of really targeted early childhood interventions for disadvantaged children. And these kind of interventions, they also produce similarly pronounced long-term effects for disadvantaged children and youth, okay? So for citizenship, we again find effects on college going, and we do find effects also on high school outcomes. So probability of completing the academic track increases. Now, Christina and I have looked at the short-run effects during childhood. And in a first paper that we've done that has really kickstart this whole agenda, we found positive effects on language proficiency and early educational outcomes, especially on tracking into gymnasium. We really found super large effects of that birthright citizenship reform. So with those benefiting from it would have a much higher probability of ending up in gymnasium, so in the academic track of high school. We saw equally positive effects on grades and interactions with natives in adolescence. But we also have a paper that demonstrates that there is one subgroup of second-generation immigrants for whom the reform actually caused a backlash. And these are immigrant girls with a Muslim background. And what we show in this paper is that for these girls, the reform really led to intergenerational conflicts about integration into society, okay? So that's what we know about the more short-run effects of these policies. Now, how can we bring all of this together to kind of have a narrative of what's going on here? Now, with birthright citizenship, second-generation kids are exposed to the same opportunities as natives from the very start of life. And if this is producing any kind of persistent effects, then the changes must first occur inside families, not with childcare. With childcare, this is probably things that are happening outside the family. Here it must happen inside the family. So in childhood, because there are already effects, positive effects during childhood of that reform, it very likely increases parental incentives to invest in their children, in their human capital. And of course, in adolescence, and Christina and I have partly shown this, the kids themselves will have higher aspirations because of the chances that this reform affords them. Okay? And all of this together can explain these long-term, persistent long-term positive effects that we have highlighted in this study. So instead of wrapping up, let me tell you about one other study that we are currently doing on this, and just maybe so that to make these estimates, which are sizable, more credible. So we have this other study that looks at crime, so birthright citizenship and youth crime. And by youth crime, I mean crimes committed at ages 15 to 20. And we find equally large positive effects, and positive effects are actually reductions in crimes or the propensity to commit crimes amongst immigrant youth who benefited from that reform. Okay? So I think I've already given you a summary. Maybe let me just say this. I mean, I think what I really find striking and what strikes me about these findings is that we are talking here about fairly small changes in conditions at the very start of life. You know, a piece of paper, a passport, 5 extra months of childcare. But these small changes in early lifehood conditions, I think that's what our results show, they can make a big difference for the second generation in the long run. And I guess that's the most striking aspect that I'm taking away from the research that we have been doing and are still doing on these issues. So thank you for your attention.